Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for our latest installment of the 2018 Climate Tracking and Transparency webinar series. My name is Cynthia Elliott. I'm with World Resources Institute, and I'll be providing a brief introduction to today's webinar, which is going to focus on measuring transformational change impacts. I'm joined by a number of colleagues at WRI, including Pauline Hill, who's managing the GoToWebinar platform today. This webinar series is co-organized by World Resources Institute's Tracking and Strengthening Climate Action Initiative, or TASCA, together with the Partnership on Transparency in the Paris Agreement, known as PATPA, in order to share existing knowledge and best practice related to improving domestic transparency systems. Pauline, next slide, please. On today's webinar, I'm going to provide some basic instructions for participation, and then I'll provide a brief overview of the TASCA project and PATPA initiative, and then we'll hear from our three presenters today. Presentations will be followed by a question and answer session where attendees will be able to submit questions directly to the panelists. So please feel free to use this function throughout the presentation. Next slide, please. During this webinar, attendees will remain in listen-only mode. If you want to raise comments or questions, please type them into the questions pane in the GoToWebinar control panel. So you'll see a drop-down option where you can type in your questions and comments, and we'll address those at the end of the presentations. Next slide, please. The TASCA project is managed by WRI and aims to support governments to be able to transparently communicate progress toward their NDCs, meet international accounting and reporting requirements, account for their commitments, and identify additional abatement opportunities to support national dialogue on future commitments. We currently work in 5 countries: Colombia, Ethiopia, India, Indonesia, and South Africa. And the activities that we engage with in these countries depends on the national government's views, but lessons learned and resources developed are shared globally. In addition to our in-country work, TASCA actively supports enhancing international transparency, and we provide timely research and analysis to support the negotiations and convene dialogues and discussions with country parties in order to consider different options. We're also developing new tools and data platforms to support analysis for decision-making and tracking implementation. Next slide, please. The Partnership on Transparency in the Paris Agreement was launched at the in 2010 at the Petersburg Climate Dialogue by South Africa, the Republic of Korea, and Germany. PATPA promotes ambitious climate action through practical exchange on enhanced transparency to support achievement of the global temperature goal. And PATPA supports its mission through policy dialogues and convenings to build capacity and encourage peer exchange, and develops research products to disseminate knowledge. Next slide, please. So now we'll get to the core of today's webinar, and we have 3 experts joining us today. First, we'll hear from Neelam Singh, a senior associate with the climate program at WRI. Then we'll hear from another WRI colleague, Joe Thwaites, with the Finance Center, followed by Katharina Paetz with the NAMA facility. So with that, I'd like to hand things over to Neelam, who will start with our first presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the topic of transformational change. In my presentation, I will start with introducing the ICAT guidance on transformational change, which provides step-by-step guidance to assess transformational impacts of policies and actions. Let's start with an introduction to ICAT itself. ICAT, or the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, was started to support countries in assessing the impacts of climate policies and actions, and to support transparent and ambitious climate action. There are 2 main components here: development of a series of ICAT guidance to help assess the greenhouse gas, sustainable development, and transformational impacts of policies in an integrated fashion, as well as building capacity by supporting partner countries towards improving policy design and impact assessment capacity. Next slide, please. It's a multi-stakeholder initiative with three main implementing partners: the UNEP-DTU partnership, VERA, which was earlier called VCS, and the World Resources Institute, as well as a few supporting member organizations that participated in the development of various guidance documents. The Transformational Change Guidance in particular was led by UNEP-DTU partnership and co-led by WRI. The guidance development process lasted over a year. It was quite an intense process that involved contributions from experts all around the world in the form of a technical working group. It went through a public comment and a review period as well. And we are currently piloting the guidance in some countries and will be sharing a revised version that incorporates examples and case studies from these applications that are underway sometime next year. It is designed to be a flexible guidance with a list of key recommendations or good practice recommendations, and is meant to be used in all sectors for all kinds of policies and actions. Next, please. This just shows the entire toolbox of guidance for the assessment of greenhouse gas sustainable development and transformational impacts of policies and actions, and a few other supporting guidance documents. So as you can see, the Transformational Change Guidance is one of the 10 guidance documents currently being developed under the ICAT. Next one, please. So diving into the topic of transformational change. So what do we mean by transformational change? It refers to fundamental systemic change, a change that is sustained for a period of time and disrupts the existing paradigm, the carbon-intensive ways of production and consumption. The guidance defines transformational change in the context of climate mitigation, as you can see on the slide here. Next one, please. The penetration of smartphones and the internet in our society are some obvious, clear examples of transformational change. With regards to mitigation, examples such as transforming energy systems in Germany, the remarkable decline in deforestation in Brazil are some instances where we see sustained transition that is underway. The next presentation will also talk about some of these examples, so I will move on here. Next, please. So where do we begin in our assessment of the transformational change impacts? One of the first steps here is to understand why the user wants to carry out this exercise. What are the objectives of the assessment? Obviously, it is to help users assess the extent of transformation expected in future or already achieved by policies in the past, which in turn could support decision makers develop effective strategies for transformational change through a better understanding of how policies set in motion processes that lead to transformational outcomes. It could also be to facilitate learning from experience and ongoing monitoring. It could be to attract climate finance by demonstrating how a policy facilitates transformational change in the desired direction, and to support communication of impacts to whoever may be the audience. Next one, please. The ICAT Transformational Change Guidance can be used ex ante or ex post before the policy is implemented, or after it has been implemented or during implementation, to help inform the design of the policy or to understand the effectiveness of its implementation and communicate the impact of implemented policies or actions. Next one, please. The guidance is divided. This is a little bit hard to read, but hopefully you can glean some information here. It is divided into 5 parts and includes a chapter for each major step in the assessment. The bulk of the impact assessment steps to understand the transformational impact of your policy are described in part 2 and 3. And in this slide, you can see all the steps which correlate with the various chapters, though I won't be going through all the steps in detail in the presentation, just given the time. Next one, please. So I'll just focus on a couple of things that are very foundational to the transformational change impact assessment as explained in the guidance. So the guidance explains transformational impacts in terms of processes and outcomes. It describes a framework of process and outcome characteristics to help us assess the extent of transformation. Outcome characteristics in particular refer to the scale or the magnitude and sustained nature or durability of outcomes resulting from a policy. This goes back to the definition of the transformational change a few slides earlier. We are trying to assess what's the scale of change measured in terms of GHG reductions and selected sustainable development impacts across environmental, social, and economic dimensions such as air quality, health, jobs, energy security, etc. And also trying to determine whether these changes are sustained over time, are durable. And the two together tell us whether the change being seen, being observed, is transformational or not. Process characteristics describe how a policy can trigger changes in society in the desired direction. These are the intermediate steps or the means to realize transformational outcomes of scale and durability. So these are pretty much the means that policymakers can use to drive transformational change. These relate to technology that helps propel change. So what are the levers to promote research and innovation? How can you help adoption and scale up technological innovation? Who are the agents of change that can be tapped, be it entrepreneurs, coalitions that come together as advocates or of beneficiaries of policies? What kind of incentives, economic or non-economic incentives, be employed? And what kind of institutional and regulatory support structures are there to realize transformational change, as well as how is the policy tackling societal norms, awareness and behavioral change that is so critically needed for any kind of paradigm shift. So think of these process characteristics as the ingredients to the recipe of transformational change. Each context and where the society is in the phase of development will determine how these ingredients come together to create the perfect recipe to enable transformational change in the desired direction. So ingredients could be the same, but they come together in different proportions at different points in time to create transformational change based on context, practices, etc. Next one, please. This figure just brings it all together. This is the foundation of the assessment process as laid out in our ICAT guidance. Next one, please. So the user begins the assessment with an understanding of the policy or action that she wants to investigate and understand for its transformational impacts. So you describe the policy and lay out the vision you have for transformational change through the implementation of that policy. And then next comes a significant step of choosing process characteristics that are relevant for your context. So if you have a solar PV policy, for instance, and the ICAT guidance document runs through this particular hypothetical policy to illustrate each step. So determine, for example, whether the process characteristic of research and innovation are critical in the solar PV sector in your context, or is it more the adoption and scale up in the sector that needs to be the main area of intervention, or economic incentives are more likely to pay off, etc. So you determine which characteristics are relevant to your context, and it's a dynamic process in the sense that the relevance of process characteristics can vary over time due to changes in underlying conditions and circumstances. Different process characteristics may become relevant over time, or some may no longer be relevant. So it is important to revisit the relevance regularly, assuming there was some sort of ongoing monitoring here. Next one, please. So once you have described your policy or action and articulated the goals and vision for change through the policy and selected your transformational characteristics that are relevant to assess, we then look at how the policy is impacting each characteristic that you have selected. So how the policy impacts technology, scale up in the country or sector. We identify key performance indicators for each characteristic and monitor how the indicator value changes over time at the starting situation, and then if you're doing ex ante for expected transformation over a number of years, or in case of ex post, what has happened. Here in this slide, I have used just one process characteristic, scale up in the technology category, to help illustrate the point. The guidance provides templates for every characteristic for solar PV policy to walk the users through each step. Next one, please. Finally, the guidance uses a scorecard at each step to determine how transformational the policy is, which is aggregated in the end to get an overall score, which you can plot here. However, we realize that it is a subjective exercise. However, you can enhance its credibility through the involvement of stakeholders and by including detailed rationale to justify the score in each step. But the idea was that if you have an overall score, perhaps that is a useful metric for the policymakers to work with, even though very much acknowledging that there is a lot buried in that one score. Next one. Finally, the assessment, whether in its disaggregated or aggregated form, can be useful at different stages of policy planning and implementation. And this just shows the various points where you can you can take input from the assessment to influence the policy cycle, and regular review and the flexibility to make modifications in your policy is particularly important, also given the long-term nature of transformational change in general. And I think that is my next one, please. Here you can see the link to the ICAT Transformational Change Guidance. It is broken down in chapters on the ICAT website and is available in user-friendly modules as well as a full guidance in PDF form. So feel free to take a look at it at this website, but I will stop here and hopefully haven't gone over my time, and would invite the next presenter, maybe give it over to Cynthia.
Thanks, Neelam. So I believe our next presenter is Joe. So I'll hand this just back over to Joe.
Thank you very much. Yes, so Neelam did a great overview of a lot of the theory and the planning behind transformation. And I'm going to focus mainly on a couple of case studies that come from a report that we did in 2016 called Transformational Climate Finance and Exploration of Low Carbon Energy. But first of all, I think it's worth just sort of showing you some of the literature review we did. And a lot of this sort of aligns very closely with what Neelam was mentioning. I think the one important thing to mention is that this concept of transformation happening in different spheres is quite important, and the figure on the right, which shows the sort of the nested sphere concept. So at the center, you see there's a practical sphere. That's behaviors, technical responses. In the middle is the political sphere. That's systems and structures, whether financial, political, legal, social, economic. And then in the outermost sphere is the personal, and that's the idea of deep-rooted, changing worldviews, values. These interact, that actions that affect the practical can filter up to the other levels. But the sense that when you're talking about transformation, the idea is that you're going to be changing all of them eventually. And then the next thing to mention is that we hear the word transformation quite a lot in the world of climate finance. probably the best example is the Green Climate Fund, whose governing instrument talks about the need to promote a paradigm shift towards low emission and climate resilient development pathways. And they use paradigm shift as a synonym for transformation there. So in our definition, and again, this aligns really closely with what Neelam was talking about, we define transformation in climate finance in three ways: large magnitude impact, non-linear change, and then being sustained and long term. In terms of the non-linear nature, I think this is a really helpful graph that talks about how you have different phases. And I think the first phase, with pre-development phase, you may not actually see very much change, but there may be a lot going on below the water, so to speak, like a duck paddling, and you can't see it furiously paddling away. Then you see the takeoff stage and the acceleration, where the change becomes manifest and self-reinforcing, and then eventually stabilization into a new equilibrium. And globally, there are some signs that there are early indicators of a societal shift towards low carbon energy. So this graph shows the installed capacity in gigawatts of both solar PV in dark blue and wind in yellow. And I think the solar one even is perhaps the more interesting and striking, and you see it sort of follows that same trajectory of the S curve in the previous slide, in that it's really getting steep, but for both of them, their deployment in the last decade has increased almost exponentially. So now I'm going to move on to the two case studies, and we examined 9 case studies in total in this paper, but I picked 2 of the perhaps the most transformational and most exciting that we found. So first of all is wind power in Uruguay. Uruguay is a relatively small country in Latin America. They went from having virtually no wind generation in 2007 to becoming a double world record holder in less than a decade. By 2013, they were receiving the largest share of clean energy investment as a percentage of GDP of any country in the world. And then in 2014, they installed the most wind power per capita of any country. And then you see here, by the end of 2017, they'd installed around 1.5 gigawatts of wind capacity, and that provided 30% of electricity generation in the country. Wind energy is now cost competitive, and it's displacing the most expensive fossil fuel generation in the country. The driver for this change really was a desire to increase energy security. Uruguay had relied quite heavily on hydropower historically, but they faced a decade of drought between 1997 and 2007. And so hydro's share of electricity generation fell from over 90% to around 50%. And that caused an increase in fossil fuel imports. So by 2007, fossil fuels were providing a third of generation, but this was coming at huge cost. They also faced steadily rising electricity demand, and so the government sought ways to diversify its energy sources. And so in 2007, Uruguay secured a grant of $1 million from the Global Environment Facility. This is a multilateral climate fund, and they partnered with the UN Development Program. The national government of Uruguay put in $6 million of its own money in co-financing, and they created the Uruguay Wind Energy Program. And this program ran until 2012, and it focused in 2 areas: on policy reform and on technical capacity building. So in terms of policy reform, the program supported the government to create an ambitious national policy on renewable energy. This included a competitive bidding mechanism for large-scale renewable development, as well as a feed-in tariff for smaller-scale systems. The energy law they passed also required the state-owned utility company to buy up all the clean power that was generated on the market. And it also included a bonus to encourage early development of renewables, that producers that were able to construct and capacity that came online before 2015 were allowed to receive a higher price for electricity. And I think you can see that really worked. You see that how the deployment really jumped up starting in 2014, and it's continued pretty much ever since at a fairly similar rate. The second part, the technical capacity building, was focused on training staff at the electricity utility on how to work with variable renewable energy sources and how to integrate them into the grid and balance them. They had a little prior experience in doing this, so the state utility actually built a demonstration wind farm, and that's where most of the $6 million went. But they also created a renewable energy curriculum at the National University to train their staff, and did outreach to developers and investors to build their knowledge and address their risk perceptions. These dialogues also helped with regional cooperation. Uruguay is actually now working with the Brazilian utility to develop wind projects along their shared border. So I think the key sort of takeaways is Uruguay's reforms provided both the policy stability and the technical expertise to kickstart wind investment. And they're now attracting around $1 billion a year in investment in clean energy. They continually exceeded their targets, and they've actually had to revise them upwards because they were beating their goals so many years early. And they demonstrate how using climate finance for smart policy and effective training can have a transformative effect in terms of renewable energy development. This just a few $1 million in public funding, but they created this stable enabling environment that's allowed billions of dollars in private investment to flow in, resulting in a rapid wind power development. And in fact, they're now, we met with the former head of their energy regulator, and he was saying, the aim now is to replicate what we've done on wind power for solar. So the next example is Bangladesh. And they have one of the largest and fastest growing off-grid solar photovoltaic home system programs in the world. So these are the small scale systems between around 20 and 120 watt peak capacity. They're relatively inexpensive. They cost around $400 for a 50 watt peak system. And these are the kind that you can install on homes. Bangladesh's program was launched in 2003, and it focused on connecting rural areas and providing them with electricity access. They had a target of installing 50,000 systems over 5 years, but they soon ended up installing this number each month. That's months, so the 5-year target, and then they were doing that monthly. By May 2017, they'd installed around 4.1 million systems that served 18 million people. That's 12% of the country's total population. They've been made affordable through quite an innovative combination of subsidies and concessional loans. The loan portion is offered through local microfinance institutions. So you may have heard of Grameen Shakti. So it's those kind of organizations that have been doing this. And this model has addressed both the credit risk and affordability, which has allowed a rapid scale up. What they did was they fixed the grant subsidy at $25, which actually meant that for a poorer household that tended to opt for the smaller scale systems, they received a greater proportional amount of support. So it was a fairly progressive approach. And then the microfinance institutions are able to refinance the loans that they make, about 70 to 80% of the value, from a state-owned company, the Infrastructure Development Company Limited, or IDCOL. And that provides the microfinance institutions with long-term access to finance and liquidity, which is quite important. The current phase of the program which runs from 2012 to 2018, cost just under $400 million. Around half of that came from local resources, so the national government, and from microfinance institutions. And then the other half came from MDBs, the Global Environment Facility, and some bilateral contributors. The estimated reduction in carbon emissions that has resulted from switching from kerosene lamps to solar is around 160,000 metric tons a year. And the development impacts have been quite important as well. They've increased per capita income by 9 to 12%, and household ownership of durable goods by 23 to 27%. The ownership model is also important to talk about, that compared to a leasing approach where you'd loan the panels to people, when they're actually buying the panels outright over time, it's resulted in a better upkeep of the systems because people feel an ownership and a greater stake in it. And then also it's important to say that providing off-grid electricity access has been much quicker and cheaper than expanding the grid. And so in that sense, it's potentially transformational model of energy ownership. But that being said, with many households still lacking electricity, the challenge is to expand the program, make it more financially sustainable, while maintaining the affordability for the poorest households. Also a need to increase the quality and reliability of hardware. ICAT set a target to finance 6 million solar home systems by 2021, so they've got another couple of million to go to hit that. And lastly, it's worth noting that ICAT last year got accredited to the Green Climate Fund, so that could provide an important opportunity to scale up. So based on this, we developed a framework, and I won't dwell on this too long because I think you have the slides, and I know I'm almost out of time. But I think you've probably noticed that this is quite similar to the framework that Neelam presented. So it's designed to outline the different stages for planning, and then also the evaluation, and then feeding back into future planning. And then lastly, we also looked at some of the metrics to assess low carbon energy transformation. And I think the really important thing to say here is that no single metric is really going to capture it, and that it's important to track a suite of metrics to give a more rounded picture of transformational potential and then impact. And it's also important to say that it's the change in the value of these metrics that is probably more informative than absolute numbers. That it's when you see the graph and you can see compared, when Uruguay or Bangladesh started out and then where they got to. I think that change over time is the really important thing to be tracking. But I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joe. Thanks for the additional context on the concept of transformation, what that means, and providing these very, very useful examples. So I think we'll move to our final presenter now. So I'll invite Katharina to please share her insights.
Yeah, thanks, Cynthia, and to Neelam and Joe for these really interesting inputs. And thanks for inviting the NAMA facility to this webinar. Actually, the supporting transformational change processes has been the NAMA facility's key objective since the NAMA facility's inception in 2013. And the NAMA facility has the vision to accelerate low carbon development, to keep temperature rises to 1.5 degrees by financing measures that transform or ultimately transform challenging sectors in a country towards a sustainable, irreversible, low-carbon pathway. The NAMA facilities, for those who might not know, is a multi-donor fund jointly established by Germany and UK, and Denmark and the European Commission joined in 2015 as additional donors. And the total funding made available through the NAMA facility since its inception has been approximately 340 million euros. The NAMA facility looks at the transformational change potential throughout the process cycle, meaning from the assessment of the initial idea submitted to seek funding from the facility to the design adjustment phase. And the facility, we call it detailed preparation phase, to the implementation phase. Accompanying planned learning and evaluation activities that the NAMA facility will undertake from next year onwards will also put special emphasis on the analysis of signals of transformational change. And transformational change is likewise part of the NAMA facility's monitoring system. The relevance of transformational change for the facility is reflected in the fact that one of its 5 mandatory core indicators looks at signs for potential transformational change. Next slide, please. The potential for transformational change is central in the selection process. The NAMA facility aims at supporting and fund the implementation of the most ambitious part of a sector-wide NAMA. And during the selection process, a combination of ambition and feasibility criteria inform the decisions. And within the ambition criteria that you can see here at the left side of the slide, the potential for transformational change criterion is key. And you can see here on the right side a selection of what we look at when assessing the potential for transformational change. For example, we look at the government commitment and endorsement because we consider this key for to have really a sustainable strategy and impact. Then embeddedness in national strategies, including NDCs, is another aspect that we look at when assessing the incoming ideas. And also of key importance is to have an idea whether there is a potentially catalytic effect and if the scope is appropriate to really trigger or initiate the process of transformational change. We also have a look whether this envisaged change will be done in a rapid manner. We look at scalability, potential when we scan the ideas, and then, which was also mentioned in the previous inputs from Neelam and Joe, we look at the sustainability because we intend to support actions that initiate an irreversible change. The NAMA facility does acknowledge that sector transformation is a process that, of course, often takes a decade or longer. And that is why we look at the potential for transformational change. And during the implementation of NAMA facility supported action, that is a process which takes often up to 5 years. We look for whether there are signals for transformational change that can be identified. Within the international climate finance community, there is a growing recognition of the importance to support climate actions leading potentially to transformational change, and that is to a low carbon sector or ultimately to low carbon societies. And the reason why this concept is also becoming increasingly important for many organizations is just the urgency of action that is required. And I think the latest IPCC report just underlined this this notion of urgency. But just to mention, there is an intense exchange between climate finance institutions about how to define and how to operationalize transformational change. And the aim of this exchange is to learn what approach other institutions take and to identify, if possible, also commonalities. And we at the facility believe that this is important to avoid a situation where implementers and policymakers or country representatives need to learn various definitions and requirements in order to, for example, apply for funding. And of course, we are also in exchange with other institutions like WRI on this topic and can learn from especially research institutions also a lot for our internal processes. Next slide, please. The NAMA facility, as mentioned, has the objective to improve its definition and operationalization of transformational change, with the objective to be able to clearer communicate its approach in this regard. And the NAMA facility is pursuing this goal by a couple of activities that are planned for 2019. We plan to further refine the definition of transformational change in the particular NAMA facility context. We also will work on further developing the operationalization. We have a couple of evaluation and learning activities coming up, and some of these activities will also in particular focus on transformational change. We would like to deepen the exchange and learning with and from other stakeholders, and especially share also what we have learned and make that available to interested stakeholders. And last but not least, there are two projects supported by the NAMA facility that are currently piloting the guidance on transformational change that has been developed by UNAPTU and WRI, and that Neelam presented here beforehand. So we are very happy about this exercise and collaboration, and based on the results of these two teams, we will consider how to make use of this guidance in the future, and how to support the NAMA support projects that we are funding with like accessing the potential for transformational change, or also looking back. In addition, just to mention here, the NAMA facility plans to organize a workshop or conference in Bonn next year during the upcoming SBI SABSTA meeting in 2019. And we will organize this workshop potentially in collaboration with other climate finance institutions. The workshop will focus on transformational change and what lessons we have learned so far, and will also allow implementers to share their experience on this topic. And yes, I mean, it would be great if some of the participants of this webinar would also be there and join us for this common learning exercise, and would be nice to continue the discussion here. Next slide, please. Yeah, I wanted to give like really a short snapshot of what we consider to be transformational. Here is one example from Thailand. This supported NAMA support project aims to achieve market transformation of Thailand's rice production from current practice towards low methane emissions rice sector through the introduction of low emission technologies. The rice NAMA will hopefully ultimately enable a shift towards low emission rice production in Thailand through a combination of technical support, policy dialogue, and investment. And this project pursues the objective of transforming the rice production via technical assistance and training, via the initial capitalization of a revolving fund that will provide liquidity for a range of services intended to reduce GHG emissions from rice agriculture, including technologies like laser land leveling, and policy formulation and supporting measures to promote low emission production on national political level are completing this approach. And the NSP, as to mention, it just entered into implementation. You can see that here at the indication of the duration. So it started in 2018. So this is yeah, just a projection what will happen, but we will follow the process closely and learn from this implementation process, and hopefully see during the implementation some signs of yeah, or signals of the sector transforming towards a low carbon sector or pathway. Next slide, please. So the second example is Colombia, but I will speed up a little bit so that we have sufficient time for questions. Colombian cities aim to transform urban planning with support of the NAMA facility. And they want to promote better designed, walkable, transit-oriented neighborhoods. And the project is already or has already been in implementation for a couple of years. And already these actions led to setting up an interministerial body supporting policymakers and stakeholders to integrate climate change considerations and in particular transportation and urban development models, and with this the spread of the TOD model. And here again, just to briefly summarize, it's like a combination of different activities. One key is the development of a policy framework that can be applied at different levels and basically spread out throughout the country. It's also planned to implement concrete projects in 4 selected cities to demonstrate really the benefits of the TOD model and enable other municipalities to also implement and see the benefits of this model. And thirdly, to leverage additional funding to increase the impact and make it like really transformational. Yeah, this has really just been a snapshot of the 2 NAMA facility supported actions, but I'm happy to answer more specific questions during the Q&A session. And also I would like to invite those who are in particular interested in the financial mechanisms applied in the NAMA facility supported actions to join the NAMA facility webinar that is coming up on the 21st of November on this particular topic. The registration is already open and the link can be found on the NAMA facilities website. Thanks, and back to Cynthia.
Excellent. Thank you, Katharina, for your useful presentation, these further examples, and also sharing information about the open session plan for next year and the upcoming webinar. So I also encourage participants to visit the NAMA facility webpage to find out more about those. So at this point, we have time to answer your questions. As a reminder, please use the questions pane in the GoToWebinar panel. Please type in your questions and submit them. So at this point, I would like to turn over to Neelam, who is going to be managing the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia. So we have a few questions that have come in already, but feel free to type in more questions as you have heard all the presentations now. I'll start with the first one. There is a lot of guidance mentioned in your slide. Is this guidance related to design only and not at the operational stage projects, and how these projects are monitored or measured? So yeah, there was a lot of information packed in there, and it was there's more, only I mean we had very little time to present here, but hopefully the guidance itself can provide a lot more detail and answer some of your questions with regard to whether it is the guidance can be applied, as I said, in the design stage or during implementation or after implementation. So it could be ex ante or ex post. It's not limited only to the design stage. You can also apply it after it has been implemented to understand the impacts and then hopefully learn from the implementation to inform, well, if there is a phase 2 of that policy, or to inform subsequent actions and policies in that sector. How are these projects monitored or measured? So the guidance is not doing the monitoring. I mean, the ICAT initiative is not doing the assessment. The ICAT initiative has provided the guidance that individual users, researchers, policymakers can apply and will come up with, and they are the ones who will then be responsible for monitoring these results as well over time. We are, as I mentioned, we are piloting the guidance document in a few countries. and some of those are ex ante or ex post. We have a mix of cases so far. And in some cases, because if they have shown interest in understanding the transformational impacts of their work, they probably started out with a transformational vision, and they have been monitoring the project or the particular action or the impacts of policy in any case over a period of time. And those are, so looking back, they do have some data, and going forward, they're trying to determine what kind of data to track on a regular basis. So yeah, it is an added cost, or it is as part of monitoring the implementation of your policy or action. You could include indicators that would speak to some sector level or economy level changes that would reflect, to what extent transformational change is occurring. And as I think Joe mentioned in his remarks, it's really the rate of change that's important rather than the absolute value. So hopefully, you can, depending on the sector and the policy, come up with a range of indicators that would be feasible to monitor, but at the same time provide a comprehensive picture of changes as a result of the policy, or where for transformational change, where maybe it's not possible to have direct attribution, but at least look at to what extent the policy is contributing. So the next question is, I think for Joe, could you compare the example of Bangladesh with the similar program in Barbados? And there's another question that has come in for Joe about the wind power in Uruguay example. What represents a new sustainable level of wind power supply? Has the transformational process matured? So I'll stop there and let Joe respond, and then move to other questions.
Sure. Great, thank you, Neelam. Yes, so Peter, that's a great question. I'm actually not aware of the Barbados example, but I would be really interested in hearing some more. I don't know if it's been more successful or had some challenges, but I think so. I can't really answer in terms of comparison with Barbados, but if you'd like to reach out, it'd be great to hear more about that if you're aware of that. Then on Neil's question on the sustainable level of wind, so I think from a technical point of view, I don't think 30% is not at the level where they're going to have real challenge in terms of grid integration. In terms of financial or how much do they need, I think part of the challenge in Uruguay was that they were looking to expand their grid capacity. They wanted to, I think they'd gone from 3 gigawatts total capacity, and now you see they've got 1.5 gigawatts in wind itself. So they've increased by half their total grid capacity. I think in terms of what the where they'd be reaching saturation point and too much wind, I don't think they're there on a technical level. I think there's as I said, they're now looking to solar and the question of particularly with renewables, it's good to have a whole portfolio of different renewables, because then it makes it easier to balance a little bit. So I think that's the I think their emphasis, I understand from talking with some of the staff there, is that they're happy with the progress of wind. They've carried on, as you saw in the graph, even in 2017, installations carried on at a similar rate. But their emphasis now, from a policy perspective, has been on scaling up other forms of renewable energy. But I think it's an interesting question of if private investors are still willing to build new wind capacity, is there a point at which you have to go, whoa, we're good, we're in the stabilization phase now, and is there a need for the government to come in at a certain point? My sense is probably not right now, but it's an important thing to take note of, that you obviously don't. One challenge around the world is over capacity, not so much with renewables, but if you've built too much capacity and then the grid can't handle it, or you don't. Often, one of the big challenges we found when we looked at the case of China is a lot of renewable energy that they'd developed, and they hadn't built out the transmission and distribution infrastructure. So you had wind farms that were sort of sitting dormant, which is not a great situation. So I think the challenge is to look along the whole cycle of everything that you're going to need, both from the regulatory perspective, from the distribution infrastructure, and then also the capacity itself. Transmission and distribution gets notoriously underfunded because partly because for politicians it's hard to cut a ribbon on a grid cable. It's much easier to unveil a new power plant or a wind or solar facility than it is for transmission and distribution. But it is critical to make sure that is upgraded and capable of managing particularly renewable supply, which has some different characteristics.
Thank you. Okay, so there are a few other questions. I'll just move in order here. It is becoming apparent that transformational change impacts are happening at a minimum at a regional or national level. How do you see companies or businesses participating and or initiating positive transformational change impacts regarding climate and sustainability? I can go first, but hopefully Joe and Katharina can also contribute to this based on your experiences. So I think there is a lot of potential for companies or businesses to participate. I think just from the point of view of participating or becoming involved in initiatives that collectively have a transformational vision, and one that comes to mind only because it's close to home. WRI is involved in this particular initiative around science-based targets, where companies take on targets that are aligned with the temperature goals, and by participating in such targets, even though one individual company cannot perhaps trigger transformational change, it's too small player, though there are bigger companies too whose rival economies of nations, but at this, I mean, basically the idea is like collectively, if you are contributing through these initiatives which have a transformational vision, then you're helping in the process of transformational change. I would also think private sector plays a huge role in climate finance, in leveraging investments towards technologies that can help with transformational change. So they definitely have a huge role to play. Katharina or Joe, would you like to contribute more?
Yeah, I'm happy to contribute.
Go ahead, Katharina.
Please go ahead, Joe.
No, after you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, just to underline what Neelam has said. So I think the private sector is really key when it comes to climate finance, because it can leverage the effect that can be achieved with public funds. And I can say also for the NAMA facility that for us it's key that there is in most sectors private sector involvement. And I mean, in terms of initiating positive transformational change impacts, which was the second part of the question, I think it's also extremely important that the private sector is at least communicating what would be interesting to implement. For example, I recently spoke to some companies here in Germany on like their idea to introduce a circular economy model. And but for that, they are starting with this, but they would need some specific regulation. And I think that is also something where companies could start like to develop their own vision of transformational change and like how to implement climate action. and then to engage with the public sector on how the public sector could support this, or what support would be needed.
Joe, you want to add more?
Sure, yeah, I'd just say, yes, I agree the private sector is really important. And one of the things that we found in some of our case studies was the examples where the private sector was willing to invest and to work really closely with government. So Denmark was, we looked in both developed and developing countries. And in Denmark, their sort of development of renewables, and particularly offshore wind, involved a close partnership between private utilities, private renewable energy companies such as Vestas and the government, and they worked really closely together on R&D. I think you see the same in the US with the way that the Silicon Valley grew up. It was very closely linked to a lot of government investment in IT infrastructure and research. So that close partnership on research and development, but also a willingness to sort of invest and to respond. We talk about needing a stable environment for the private sector, but the private sector also needs to respond to the signals that they're getting from governments, whether that be at the international level through the Paris Agreement or national policies. And so there are good examples of that. Uruguay is one of them. And Bangladesh as well, where you have private solar manufacturers who responded to the demand and the program that the government set up. There's an example in Portugal, and we put this in the transformation case, but Portugal, the grid in Portugal was not being invested in. It was in private hands, and it was fragmented, lots of different companies running it, and they were failing to invest in really important upgrades that would be necessary to handle renewable energy. And at a certain point, the government sort of tired of telling them and nationalized the grid, and then was able to invest in it. And they've partly then reprivatized elements. But the lesson there was kind of that private industry can ignore these signals at their peril, and there's a really need for them to there's plenty of examples of where they work harmoniously and closely with governments. But if they're not, I think, as someone already mentioned, the IPCC report shows the scale of urgency, and we've seen it many times throughout history where to face really urgent and grave challenges, governments have come in and worked very closely with the private sector to meet demands in times of war and other extreme circumstances. I think climate change is in a similar situation to that. And so there's a way of doing it harmoniously, and there's also a way of governments kind of getting fed up and going, well, we're going to, if you're not responding to the signals, to the enabling environments we're providing, we'll come in and nationalize. And so it's not necessarily the best outcome, or not necessarily the most efficient, but I think in terms of getting things done quickly, which is clearly what we need, we've got 12 years from the 1.5 IPCC report. I think that's a key thing that the private sector needs to take note of.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. We are unfortunately out of time, so we're going to have to cut the question session short. There are a few outstanding questions to be answered, and I'd like to just inform those participants that we will follow up with them offline to discuss further. Pauline, can you please move to the next slide? So I'd just like to thank all of our panelists for their excellent presentations, and thank you participants for joining us and providing your questions. If you've enjoyed today's webinar, I encourage you to visit our webpage to learn more about our webinar series, watch past webinar recordings, and register for future webinars. Our next webinar is scheduled for Tuesday, November 20th at 9, where we'll hear about we'll actually hear from some experts from GIZ and 2 national governments who are going to share some experience and lessons from developing countries in reporting and review of climate change information, specifically through the preparation of biennial update reports and participation in the international consultation and analysis process. To register for this webinar, please visit our website where you can also find the latest information on future webinars. We are currently planning more webinars for 2019, so if you have ideas or interests you'd like us to cover, please feel free to reach out to us. Pauline, next slide, please. Again, please contact us if you have any questions, any further questions about today's webinar or this series, and I'd like to thank everyone again for their participation, and I wish you all a good day. Thank you very much, and goodbye.